Welcome to our webinar, Overcoming the Challenges of Internal API Programs. My name is Melissa Weir, Mastery's Marketing Operations Manager, and I'll be your host for today. We will save some time and open it up for a Q&A session at the end, so feel free to enter in questions at any time. Today we're very excited to have with us Sasha Kamenetska, API Platform Analyst, and Rob Zasweta, Director of Platform Strategy at Mastery. Sasha is an API Platform Analyst on a Strategy Services team at Mastery. She conducts research and analysis of the API market and focuses on partner mapping for Mastery customers. Rob is a Director on our Strategy team where he applies his extensive web programming and business development background to helping our customers create successful API programs. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our experts. Rob, take it away.
Thanks, Melissa. So today we're going to just cover internal APIs and going over some of the things that are important to make sure you can get them up and running within your organization. So the overall agenda is we're going to talk about how to overcome those internal obstacles that you might face while implementing an internal API program. We'll talk about how to present that value both to the people who will be consuming the API as well as to the stakeholders within the organization, and how to ensure success once your program is up and running. Now, when we're talking about internal APIs, what we're really talking about are the interfacing the different systems within your organization with one another using language and platform agnostic services, basically web services. Traditionally, when you think about APIs, you're talking about opening them up to the public, either through building partnerships or having open innovation or something along those lines. But the same kind of principles that make those successful can also make a successful program internally if you apply APIs to improve productivity, etc. So to start with, you want to talk about overcoming these internal obstacles that you might be facing. And when we're talking about internal obstacles, these are going to most typically be the type of, well, we've always done things this way, why would we want to change? The good news is you can start right now. We're going to go over each of these points in detail as we move on, but by starting now, we'll discuss kind of how this works. First, you want to make sure you define and clearly communicate your goals. Make sure you understand why you're moving to an API-centric program internally. And you can start small. You can start today, in fact. Whatever your next project might be that you're going to build, rather than use the traditional proprietary methods to connect to it, consider building in some language and platform agnostic APIs to have your customers, your internal customers, access it. And then as you're doing that, make sure once you've built it, you're testing it, you've identified the metrics that you want to make sure that you're hitting, you want to repeat that success and just keep doing that over and over again and communicate that progress, not only to your team, the people who have built it, but also to the people who are consuming it. Make sure they understand what's going on and listen to them. Get their input so you can progress and make the right kinds of changes that are going to make this a success going forward. And lastly, I strongly advise finding somebody who's on the business side, whether in the sales or the biz dev department. Make sure they understand exactly what you're doing so that they can identify opportunities that you might not be able to find. I'd say that when we're talking about internal API programs, it typically starts within the IT department, and keeping it in the IT department is really the wrong way to move. You really want to make sure that your sales, biz dev, marketing, everybody is involved and knows what's going on, so they can see, they can have some input too, and again, might be able to help you move it forward. But the success of any API program starts with defining your goals and understanding exactly why you're developing this program, how to measure them, and then communicating that to your team, to your stakeholders. We typically ask these questions when we talk about external APIs, but again, it applies to internal APIs as well. What does success look like for you? We're talking about internal APIs, those kinds of language agnostic and platform agnostic APIs can help you get more rapid innovation through the flexibility they provide. You can more easily connect different technologies if you have acquired a business, or if you just want to try some new technology that may not be compatible with what you have in-house. For example, if you're a Java shop and there's a Ruby on Rails application out there you want to bring in. By connecting those through web-based APIs that are internally facing, you avoid a lot of the problems that you get with proprietary connectivity. You also can get new developers up and running, even if they have varying degrees of knowledge and experience. They can use whatever languages, whatever knowledge they're already experienced with, and using that they can get up to speed just applying this open technology that you've built for them. When you talk about the business drivers for the API, I always say that the business driver for any technology change is to either cut costs or increase revenues. And getting in APIs internally, that's really a big way that you can do that, by making sure that you can get to innovation and get products to market faster. You also want to make sure the expectations of the platform are well defined. What do you expect your developers, your consumers of your API to be able to get? What do the different business units expect to get? And then take a look at what's going on in the market. See what are really being seen as success stories, not just within your own competitive space, but outside of that space as well. In fact, that's a really extensive area to talk about. And Sasha's our in-house expert when it comes to all of this kind of analysis, so I'm going to leave it to her. Sasha, where do you get started when you're trying to do that research?
Great question, Rob. Thanks. I think the best place to get started is looking at your direct competitors. And so you want to really look at the market that you're in, look at your competitors, and look at what they're doing with APIs, and see what their successes and what their failures are. And then once you're looking at what they're doing, you can find out a lot about what's going on in your space, and you want to actually expand your research to markets that are tangentially related, and you want to look at other players in markets related to yours, what they're doing with their internal programs. Of course, sometimes it's a little bit difficult to find out information about internal APIs, so you want to look at what mobile products they're putting out, what mobile development they're doing, and look at all facets that could be related to an API program. And then once you've sort of looked in your market, in and around your market, you want to take your research in-house and actually look internally, and look at departments and other teams within your organization, and anyone who's working on more mobile-related projects, who might be developing their own APIs, and schedule some time to talk to them and find out what they're doing, what they're working on, and what their interests might be in working with you. So they might have some experiences in putting out an API program, or they might have experience in terms of the way they've been accessing data and services in your organization for their mobile development, and they'll have opinions and input for how you should structure and launch your API program. So get them involved early, start talking to them, and actually, this is a great place where you can start to find potential internal partners to use your API program once it's up and running. Once you have these interested internal teams or developers, you can actually start talking to them about potential use cases and what they might do with the API program that you're planning. And Rob, since this is your area of expertise, can you talk a little bit to the value of developing use cases with potential partners when you're planning your API program?
Absolutely. Once you've identified these internal partners, and these internal partners can live anywhere. They can be either people who are within your same organization, the same IT group, can be different groups of developers, or it can really be different business units within the company who are going to consume the kind of data and functionality that you're producing. You want to identify them and bring them in the room together, get them in as early and as often as you can. Because if you're just building an API in a vacuum, you're not going to serve anybody. So get them in the room and get them talking. Identify what they're doing with your technology or what they plan on doing with your data and your functionality now. Make sure that you've got them actually talking about the process of using it. How are they accessing it? What data are they accessing? What are they doing with that data once they have it? By going through these conversations, you can identify opportunities to make their lives easier and to create a program that's far more flexible that will serve their needs and the needs of everybody else within your organization. Start walking through some of these common use cases that they're doing. If they're building specific technology, if they're building some kind of a product internally or maybe it's even externally facing, walk through how they use the data now to get to where they are. And then do what I refer to as whiteboard programming. Start building the API theoretically. Start defining what some of these endpoints might look like. Start defining what kind of requests you might be sending those APIs and what kind of responses might be coming back. Write this all down on the whiteboard. Start building applications kind of in your mind that define how your data and functionality will look to the end user so that you can better understand and discover some of the gotchas that you might have early on. These are things you should be doing whether they're internal or external APIs. I mean, this is a very common thing, but the good news is with an internal team and an internal API, you've got far greater control and a far greater understanding of what everybody's common goals are. And then whether you're starting small or you're getting rolling with big programming, just building the API is the beginning, right? Once it's up and running, you really start to make sure that you're tracking it and that you're ensuring that you're meeting the goals that you've set and that you are ensuring the success of your program. And that starts with identifying the metrics that you should be measuring to make sure you're attaining your goals. If you establish your key performance metrics early on, you'll be able to know exactly how things are working, and more importantly, you'll be able to demonstrate to your team, to all the stakeholders that, hey, this is actually working, and we should devote more resources to it. The kinds of metrics you might want to be measuring are measuring the number of internal apps that have been developed against your API, measuring the amount of data that's transferring through your APIs versus through the legacy system so you can kind of show how that migration is working, and maybe even measuring the amount of time between hiring a new developer and getting them up to full productivity. If you can quantify those things, you can really start to demonstrate how these APIs are helping. More importantly, if you're finding that those numbers aren't reaching what your expected goals are, you can adjust as you move along to make sure that they do. But every API program needs to have the right number of resources associated with it. Again, off the top, we're talking about overcoming obstacles that are internal. And if you're measuring properly, you're getting those metrics in place, you're communicating those goals, you'll be armed to make sure that you can get the resources you need and you can overcome any internal obstacles you have. In terms of an investment for an internal API, the good news is it's typically a lot smaller than if you were opening this up externally. While you still have to worry about things like scalability and security and all of that, it's not as big a concern when you're talking about your internal systems accessing one another. Still, an API management program can really help with this. All of that reporting infrastructure and authentication infrastructure and tracking and key management, all of that is the kind of stuff that your team would otherwise have to build when really you should be spending cycles building out your APIs. An API management platform can really help with you doing the administration of the API, whether it's internally or externally. And then in terms of internal support, again, when you're talking about external APIs, you're going to have lots of people who might be sending you emails. You're going to have to work with developers using disparate systems. Internal APIs, really, it's the guy walking down the hall and asking you a question. That's fantastic. You just got to make sure that you've got your experts on staff, the people who really know how the API work, and make sure they are available. But most importantly, when people come to you and they have questions, make sure that you're tracking those questions so that other folks can find them easily. That way you're not answering the same thing over and over again. But that internal team doesn't have to be huge. It actually starts, your core team can be pretty small. You'll typically have a product manager, the person who's kind of in charge of all of your core systems, and they'll be in charge of handling a lot of the frontline technical support. They'll be the ones who are communicating everything internally, making sure the project is on task, make sure they know what's going to be put in the API, when it's going to be there, etc. They're documenting, they're measuring the analytics. The product manager is in charge of all of that kind of stuff. Whereas your engineer, it might be one or more engineers, are the ones who are actually putting it into place. Again, if you're starting small, you're starting with your next project, no big deal. It might just be one engineer or two engineers working in a couple of sprints to develop that, or it might be something that's more extensive. You got to make sure that you've got your QA resources set up. If you're doing test-driven development, make sure your tests are well written. Make sure that they're well documented, that they've been reviewed with a QA person. With web APIs, there's a lot of things you can do to make sure those endpoints are active and operating the way you expect. You can build that into your continuous testing and continuous integration systems. And then I mentioned earlier that you really want to have an advocate on the business side who you're communicating everything that you're doing so that they understand what's happening and they might have some better ideas of opportunities and ways to move forward that you might not have thought. This can be the person who's on the business development team, the sales team, the marketing team. Just keep them in the loop and make sure that they've got your back and they can start evangelizing on your behalf on that side of the house as well. But managing that team and keeping them running, that's very, very similar to managing an external API. And Sasha, when we're talking about getting developers involved and supporting them and engaging them, what are some of the tools you recommend for internal APIs, for people who are running internal APIs to make sure they're keeping on top of this?
That's a great question, Rob. I think a lot of the tools that I would recommend to engage your API users when you're running an internal program are actually fairly similar to when you have an external program. The best thing to do is start early. So when you're just starting your program, you have the most kinks to work out. There's probably there's some bugs there. Some processes aren't working the way they might ideally need to be working, and your users are going to have the best insight into what's working and what's not. So engage with your users as they're onboarding to your API. Make sure that you're staying involved with them, getting feedback from them, and that you're providing as many communication channels to them to access you as you can. One thing that we really recommend is having a face-to-face or roundtable discussion with your API users. And since this is an internal program, this is something that you could do on a more regular basis. Maybe it's a quarterly API user group that you host over lunch. And getting your users in a room together face-to-face, having some prepared questions for them around, the onboarding process, what their experience has been like with your documentation, what other APIs they might want to see from your team, things like that can really get them talking and will really give you a lot of feedback and a lot of insight into how your users are experiencing your API. And there are a few other things that you can do as well to engage with your users. We recommend having an internal blog. This could be on your internal wiki or any other tool that you use internally to communicate information. But you want to update this blog with any new changes you're making, any new features, new versions that you're putting out, anything that would be relevant to your users. And another tool you can use is a forum. So I think Rob was talking about earlier, gathering questions and feedback that you're getting and having it all documented. So this is a great place for that. A forum is a great place to put any questions that you might be getting from developers. It's also a great place to direct developers to go try and find answers to questions they already have, or for them to actually post questions and get responses. You just want to make sure that you're monitoring this carefully, you're providing answers in fairly quick responses to questions, and that you're really taking the feedback that's here as well as in all the other channels that you're providing and really putting that into action. And Rob, I know that you've run a few API programs in the past, so can you talk a little bit about how you handle making changes to the API after it's already up and running?
Yeah, I mean, the point of all this communication is to make sure that you're reacting to what the needs of your customers are. And the good news is with internal API programs, oftentimes, like I said, it's people just walking down the hall and saying, hey, I need this. And you've got that tracked. Just make sure you're tracking it. And as long as you're tracking it and the changes come in, make sure you're also not afraid to iterate, especially with an internal program. You might break some things down the line. That's true. There's definitely potential for breakage, but because you've got greater control over the development experience and who's using it, you actually have a greater opportunity to move your API forward. But that doesn't mean that you can just go it alone and wing it. You want to start by making sure you develop a versioning plan, identifying the kind of changes that might break your API consumers' programs and the kind of things that won't. The kind of things that typically break an API that require you to up version are going to be removing any kind of data that you had there before, changing the names of endpoints or changing the names of variables, or changing even the structure of those variables. So, for example, if you had an array of arrays before and now you're separating it out into 2 arrays in your response, that's a breaking change because it changes the expectations of what your clients are expecting. Non-breaking changes are pretty much anything where you add endpoints or add data. Typically, when you're talking about a RESTful API, those aren't going to change anything. Regardless, no matter what the change is, breaking or non-breaking, you got to make sure you use every communication channel you have. The blog and the forums that Sasha already mentioned, as well as any internal email systems, as well as any other internal systems you might be using. Make sure you're communicating everything. And it's just as important to communicate the non-breaking changes. One business unit might make a request that you have added something to, but adding that might actually help another business unit who didn't even know to ask or didn't even know to look. So make sure you're communicating everything. And then take advantage of the API management tools that are out there. we actually have this great tool called the API Packager. As you move from version to version, you can attach an API package, build an API package around each version, and you can track who's on each version and go prod the people who might be slagging a little bit and falling behind and get them moving to the new version. Again, because you're an internal API, you've got greater control over this. And the great thing about all of this is if you ever do migrate to an external API, all of this is already going to be in place. You're already going to be ready to go. You're already ahead of the game. Really, really appreciate everything that you listened to today. I'm glad you joined us, and now is a great time for us to take some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, both Rob and Sasha, for your insight. So if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the webinar chat box, and we'll try and get to you when we can. And if you have any questions that we're not able to answer, just feel free to email us at communications@mastery.com. So with that, we'll begin taking our first question. So our first question is, what sources can you use to do market research for your API program? So Sasha, I think you'd probably be the best person to answer that one.
Sure, thanks, Melissa. It's an interesting question for internal API programs. For external programs, we often talk about just public information that's available, any articles, anything like that. For internal programs, it's a little bit trickier. I think you want to focus more on your industry-specific publications. Anything, especially publications that are focused a little bit more on IT and technology within the organization. You might be surprised. You'll see a lot of information about mobile development and maybe even API programs, depending on the industry. And then the other thing I think everyone should take advantage of is attending some industry-specific conferences, again, more tech-focused, but that's a great way to actually hear about internal API programs and some of the internal projects that are running off of them. It's also a great way to network and meet people in your industry and meet people from similar departments and other organizations and really start talking about what they're doing. Of course, they're not going to want to tell you all their secrets, but people are actually very willing to sort of share their success and talk a little bit about what they've been doing and what's worked for them and what hasn't. And I think it's a great place to start to look at internal programs.
Great, thank you so much, Sasha. Okay, we have our next question. So we have, what are the differences between APIs and libraries and SDK?
I'll go ahead and take that one. That's actually a really good question. So we're talking about web service-based APIs here primarily, but at the end of the day, the same things that we're talking about here can be applied to DLLs, SDKs, whatever you're talking about, libraries as well. So in terms of what the difference is, a web-based API is going to be, we're talking primarily RESTful APIs. These are going to be accessible over HTTP. So I could do it through a browser, I could do it through curl, I could do it through any kind of a network library you may have. They don't require special SDKs outside of the network library, which typically comes with every single major language. And so you don't really need to do anything special there. It does help, though, if you build some custom libraries or custom SDKs. If you have a fairly customizable API, there are certain ways to get around that. And I always encourage developers to try to access the endpoints directly. Now, in terms of supporting libraries, SDKs, etc., those are also APIs, right? They're called, API means Application Programming Interface. And we're talking about SDKs, libraries, DLLs. A lot of the same things apply. You need to make sure you're building a community around what you've built. Make sure that you are listening to what they're saying, and make sure any updates you make are respecting the fact that you may or may not break the client. So you've got to give them a heads up early on to make sure that whatever you do is not going to break them, and they have a chance to get it into their development cycle. Now, having said that, if we're talking about internal APIs, that development cycle for different business units might be slightly different, but you do have greater control over that. You can always bring it up to the CTO and make sure they've got the same cycle going.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Rob. So it looks like our next question is, are there good ways to use API management for internal API programs to manage testing and iteration, moving from testing, staging to production?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So again, when we talk about the API, when we're talking about API programs, what you can do is you can sort of segment your API into separate units using a good API management program. Like there's this company, I don't know if you've heard of them, it's called Mastery. They have this product called the API Packager. The API Packager allows you to say, hey, for each API, I'm going to have a different package. And I can actually assign a key for each package so that this person can be on version 1, version 2, or this person can be on the gold package, this person can be on the silver package, however you want to set it up. When we're talking about versioning, it's really best to create those packages and have them set up as separate versions. That way you can have a person who's on version 1, when they call you and say, hey, I'm ready to migrate to version 2, you can just migrate their key, or as part of that upgrade process, you can assign them a new key under the new package. And you can track, using our API packaging tool and the reporting tools associated with it, who are making calls on what package. So you can very clearly see, oh, this person's still on version 1, I need to move them to version 2, let's get the account manager, or of course in terms of the internal API, let's get the director of development over at their desk and asking them to move that forward and figure out what it's going to take to get that in their development cycle. It actually makes this whole process so much easier. And then in terms of best practices for versioning, really the best practices are, first of all, to make sure that you are communicating everything you can possibly think of at any given time when it comes to up versioning. Identify those areas that might break clients. You really need to think in terms of your clients. And again, we're talking about internal APIs. You actually know who those customers are, so you can walk over to their desk or send them an internal email and say, hey, look, we're thinking about making this change. How is this going to impact you? Get that information from them as early as possible, and then make sure you're communicating those changes in every way, shape, or form before you even launch them. Taking advantage of something like the API Packager can make that even easier because you can make those changes, push it out in the new package, and not impact people using the older version, so you can get them to move up from there. But also, designing your API, you can design your API in such a way that you can minimize the number of versions you have to make. And I strongly recommend looking into what used to be known as HATO-OST, but is now being referred to as hypermedia-driven APIs. Instead of delivering IDs and expecting your clients to build URLs off those IDs, you're actually delivering the URLs themselves to drive them to the next state. I can go on all day about that, so I won't. But hypermedia APIs, if you Google that, or if you hit me up on Twitter or what have you, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions you got around that.
So our last question is, most of the presentation was from the perspective of an API developer championing a new program. Do you have feedback for a business or product person who wants a full-fledged API program but has challenges with internal developers who don't see the value in doing this? Great question.
That is a great question. You know, that's a bit of a tough one because your internal developers, yeah, I'm not going to say that. Your internal developers, they are going to be a challenge because they've built things, they exist, they might be looking at it and they're saying to themselves, look, this thing's out there, it's working, it's a lot of work for us to build a new API program around it. I always say start small. Identify 1 or 2 developers who are going to at least be on your side or for whom you have the influence to get them on your side. You know, if you say, look, we're going to prove this works, we're going to do it as a test, we're going to take advantage of, of some lean development practices here to test this out and to make sure it's going to work. That's your best bet. Get them started there. Find one piece and get going. You can always try building something like a Node.js front end in front of a legacy system. That's pretty light and simple. It uses JavaScript, and you know, I can't think of a developer out there who doesn't want to jump on board with Node.js just to try it out. So find somebody in your organization who's willing to do that. Do it as a side project, even though it's part of your daily development. Get them involved and get them working with it. The real benefits of an API program, both externally and internally, really revolve around flexibility. If you're using Java, for example, you're a Java house, you're probably used to using the Java messaging service. And the JMS was built in such a way that it's sort of open. It allows you to kind of communicate with other clients, but they have to kind of modify themselves to the Java-based way of doing things. It's really built for Java to talk to Java. And that can be a bad experience. It's a lot of overhead and a lot of frustration for internal systems. And this is true, I don't mean to pick just at the Java folks. I mean, this is true for every major development language, every major internal platform. They've all got some system. I mean, for Microsoft, it used to be COM and all that kind of stuff, and Cobra or Corba, you know, all these different things. If you extract that out into something that's more of a web-based API, a RESTful API is really what we're talking about. It's a lot simpler. It's a lot cleaner. It allows any language to interface with any other language because you're using this lingua franca of the internet that everybody is starting to speak. Once you've built that internally, you can start exposing that externally when you're ready, when you've got the right things in place. And again, having an API management platform there really helps because that helps with the security, that helps with the caching, that helps with the control, it helps with the reporting, all of that. So once you start building that API and then you've got your management layer in place, you can turn that on externally, and you'll immediately start seeing benefits as different teams start interfacing with things in a way that's a lot cleaner, a lot more open, a lot more flexible, a lot more responsive to their needs, as opposed to having to go and learn something very custom and very proprietary in nature. So I would make those arguments to your developers because that's some of the things that they're probably struggling with. Those are some of the pain points they're seeing. And they would oftentimes, most developers I know are going to be willing to put the effort into overcoming some of those issues and break away from, well, that's just the way we've always done it. You just got to get through that. Get through that's the way we've always done it, and try this out as a test. And I'm hoping that helps. If it doesn't, let me know. And I'm sorry, go ahead, Sasha.
No, I was going to just jump in and piggyback off of what you were saying, Rob, and say that I think most developers will like the fact that an API program will, in the future, cut down on the work that they have to do in terms of the time it takes them to develop a new product, and they can actually be more efficient and more innovative because they can spend time creating new products instead of working on existing ones or putting out the same product without an API. Another thing that you could do to sort of help motivate developers or build a little excitement around your internal API program is actually have something that we call an internal hackathon, for lack of a better way to reference it. But bring your development teams together. It can be maybe let them have a day off from work, maybe do it on the weekends, get some pizza, get some beer, and maybe a few small prizes, and let them play with your API program. Let them see what they can come up with. Maybe give them some specific challenges if there are certain types of products you want built off of your API, but let them really have fun with API program in sort of an internal hackathon type of environment, and then that should help them get familiar with your API and get them more comfortable using it, and hopefully will get them on your side and really back the API program, and they'll hopefully be more excited to use it.
You should do that whether it's a new program or an old program. I think that should be a quarterly thing for anybody that has an API.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, both Rob and Sasha. Unfortunately, for everyone who's still on the line, we are out of time. But again, if you have specific questions you weren't able to get answered, just go ahead and email us at communications@mastery.com. We thank you so much for joining us. We hope you have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. And we hope to hear from you soon. Thanks so much, and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.